The coaching inn at Marlborough smelled of wet wool and tallow candles, and the yard outside was louder than Clara Ashworth had expected for so late in the evening. She stood just inside the inn's low door with her travelling bag at her feet and her bonnet strings loosened from the cold, watching the ostlers move between the horses with their lanterns swinging yellow arcs through the dark. Her aunt's letter of instruction had said the hired post-chaise would wait at the Black Horse Inn precisely at 7 o'clock, and it was now 7:30, and the innkeeper's boy had pointed her toward the second carriage in the yard with the confidence of someone who had been pointing people in wrong directions for years. She had no reason to doubt him. She was tired past the point where doubt cost anything, and the cold was settling into her travelling boots, and there was a carriage with its door standing open and its steps let down. And so she went. She had almost reached the carriage steps when she heard it. The crash of a wooden tray against the cobblestones, and the sharp intake of breath that followed. She turned. A boy of perhaps 12, a kitchen lad by his apron, had dropped an entire tray of supper things. Pewter plates and a soup bowl and 2 tallow candles had scattered across the wet yard, and the boy was already crouching to gather them, his hands shaking from cold or panic or both. The innkeeper's wife appeared in the kitchen doorway, not to help, but to look. The ostlers did not pause. Clara set down her bag, crossed the 3 yards of cobblestone between herself and the boy, and crouched alongside him in the wet, gathering the plates and the candles and the spilled soup bowl with the same attention she might have given her own things. "The tallow is ruined," she said, "but the plates are sound. Take these first." She stacked them into his arms. The boy looked at her with the particular bewilderment of someone who had expected punishment and received help instead. She did not explain. She picked up her bag, said a plain good evening, and turned back toward the open carriage. She did not notice the man standing in the inn doorway, his coat dark against the lit interior behind him. His eyes settled on her with an attention she had not looked for and would not have known what to do with, if she had. The carriage was warm inside, surprisingly so, and had the smell of good leather and something faintly cedar-like that she could not identify. A travelling rug lay folded on the near seat. She settled herself against the far corner, tucked her bag beneath her feet, and told herself she would stay awake until Amesbury at the very least. The horses moved off almost at once, before she had even fully composed herself, and the lantern inside the carriage was a low amber thing that held the darkness at a comfortable distance. The road south from Marlborough in late November was long and mostly featureless in the dark, and the motion of the carriage was steadier than she had expected. She had not slept the night before, or properly the night before that, and the warmth was very thorough. She did not stay awake until Amesbury. She did not stay awake past the first mile. The man who settled into the opposite seat some minutes after the carriage had set off was not a man who required announcing. He had spent the better part of 3 months travelling in a manner that required no announcing, and he had grown accustomed to the particular quality of being unrecognised. He watched the woman across from him sleep, not with the invasive fixity of someone who believed themselves unobserved, but with the careful attentiveness of someone cataloguing a problem he had not anticipated. The bag beneath her feet was not his. The bonnet strings were not tied to any belonging of his household. She had boarded his private carriage by mistake, and they were now a full 2 miles down the Amesbury road, and she was deeply, genuinely asleep. He considered the options available to him and dismissed them in order of the distress they would cause her upon waking. He said nothing to his manservant, who sat across the box outside with the coachman and was not in a position to be consulted. He folded his arms and settled himself more squarely into his corner, and watched the dark Wiltshire road past the window, and waited. If someone had troubled to ask the Earl of Wyndham what he observed during those hours, he would have said very little. He would have been careful not to say more. He watched the pale, cold light of a half-hidden moon cross her face as the carriage turned south and east and the road straightened toward the valley. He watched her not stir when the wheel found a deep rut past Burbage. When the night grew colder and the rug was on the wrong seat and she had pulled her travelling coat tight against the draught from the window seam, he leaned across without waking her and settled the rug over her instead. He did not linger in the act. He returned to his corner and the carriage continued, and he watched the frost beginning to form on the window glass, and he thought about nothing that required thinking about. They reached Wyndham Park in the small hours. The house was dark except for the entry hall and the lamp Mrs. Crane had left burning in the window, as she always did when the master was expected. Tobias, coming down from the box, took in the situation with the wordless efficiency of a man who had navigated stranger things in 10 years of service, and went ahead to rouse Mrs. Crane before the carriage had fully stopped. What followed was managed quietly and with a minimum of disruption. Clara Ashworth was awoken only enough to be guided from the carriage to the house, and she registered almost none of it. The stone steps, the wide hallway, the candle Mrs. Crane carried, the warmth of a proper fire in the upstairs guest room. She was conscious only of warmth replacing cold, of a bed that was soft and deep, and entirely unlike the hard, narrow thing that had been waiting for her at her aunt's estate. And then she was not conscious of anything at all. Mrs. Crane shut the door gently and took her candle back down the corridor to find the master standing at the window of his own room, still in his travelling coat, looking out at the frost on the park lawns. "She'll sleep soundly till morning," Mrs. Crane said. "Exhausted clear through, the poor dear." "Yes," said the Earl of Wyndham. He did not turn from the window. "Shall I send word to discover who she was meant to be?" "In the morning," he said. "Nothing tonight." Mrs. Crane withdrew. The house settled. He stood at the window a while longer, watching the frost, and then he went to bed. Clara woke to the sound of a wood pigeon and the astonishing discovery that she did not know where she was. The room was large and very still, with deep-set windows whose curtains had been drawn back by someone while she slept, admitting a thin November light that fell in pale rectangles across the turkey carpet. The bed was canopied in faded green. The walls were hung with a paper of pale cream and faint gold that she did not recognize. On the dressing table sat a wash basin with water in it, and a small fire had been laid in the grate and was burning with quiet composure, as if it had been there for some time. She sat up. She was still in her travelling dress. Someone had removed her boots, which stood side by side near the hearth. The travelling rug she did not remember was folded at the foot of the bed. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and assembled what she knew, which was not much: a coaching inn, a carriage, cold and darkness and the relief of warmth. And then this. She was in someone's house. She had no idea whose. The housekeeper, who introduced herself as Mrs. Crane and had the bearing of someone who would be unsurprised by almost anything, brought her tea and answered her questions with the comfortable directness of a woman who had long since concluded that most awkward situations resolved themselves with sufficient tea. The house was Wyndham Park in Wiltshire. The master was in residence after a long absence. The young woman had evidently taken the wrong carriage at Marlborough, which happened, said Mrs. Crane, though not usually quite this thoroughly. There was no message yet from wherever she had been expected, but letters had been dispatched. "The master is below, Mrs." Crane added, setting the tray. "He thought you might prefer breakfast before anything else was arranged. The dining room or the small parlour, whichever you prefer. He is in no hurry." The master was standing near the window of the small parlour when Clara came down, his back to her, looking out at the park. He was dressed plainly. Dark coat, no decoration, a cravat tied without extravagance. He was not a large man, but he occupied the room with an ease that was not performance. When she entered, he turned and she recognized him, and the recognition took a moment to settle into something nameable. "You were at the coaching inn," she said. "I was," he said. "Please sit down, Miss Ashworth," she said. "Clara Ashworth. I apologize. I believe I took your carriage." "You did," he said, and there was a quietness in how he said it that was not reproach and not amusement, and was perhaps something between the two. "I am Harlow. Shall we find you some breakfast before we work out what is to be done?" It was not a question. She sat. He sat. Mrs. Crane brought toast and eggs and a pot of excellent coffee, and for a little while they simply ate, which Clara was grateful for, because it was the kind of practical mercy that cost him nothing and saved her a great deal. He did not press her for her situation. She did not volunteer more than she needed. She told him she had been on her way to her aunt's estate at Thornley, and that her aunt was Lady Prentice, and that she expected the mistake would be discovered and corrected in short order. He said that was likely true, and that she was welcome to remain at Wyndham Park until word came, and that no one need make more of the situation than it was. She thanked him. He inclined his head. Outside the window, the frost on the park lawns was beginning to release in the thin sun. She noticed the cleanness of his hands. She noticed the precision with which he set down his cup. These were small things, and she did not examine them. If you have stayed with a story of this kind before, you know the particular quality of its warmth. Stay a little longer. Lady Prentice arrived the following afternoon in a state of cold and managed displeasure that was worse, in its way, than open anger would have been. She came in the hired post-chaise that had been waiting at Marlborough the night before, having dispatched a letter at dawn and received a reply by midday that she found even more mystifying than the problem itself. With her came Sir Gerald Merton, which Clara had not expected and which told her something she had already suspected, that this visit was not only to retrieve her but to use the occasion for purposes that were not her own. Sir Gerald was a man of 60 or thereabouts, with the complexion of someone who had been well fed for all of those 60 years. He walked with a cane and he wore his importance like a garment. He had been a widower for 3 years, and he spoke to Clara as though she were furniture that someone had offered him at a fair price, and he was still considering whether to accept. Lady Prentice made the introductions with the brisk pleasure of a woman who was arranging something she had arranged in her own head a dozen times already. Clara stood in the entrance hall of Wyndham Park and was introduced and smiled and said the appropriate things, and everything about her posture was exactly right, and she thought of nothing in particular. Mr. Harlow received them in the drawing-room with a courtesy that was impeccable and entirely without warmth. He was not cold. He was simply exact. He offered tea. Lady Prentice accepted it with the manner of someone who had expected rather more than tea, but would have it nonetheless. Sir Gerald lowered himself into a chair and surveyed the room with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who was always calculating what things were worth. Miss Emmeline Voss, Lady Prentice's companion, took a chair near the window and arranged her face in the expression of someone who did not intend to say anything, but would remember everything. "Clara's situation is most irregular," Lady Prentice said, with a particular emphasis that meant she considered the irregularity to belong to Clara rather than to the coaching inn at Marlborough. "We are, of course, grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Harlow. Most grateful. It is fortunate she came to no harm." "Quite fortunate," Mr. Harlow said. He sipped his tea. He said nothing further on the subject. There was a quality to his stillness that troubled Lady Prentice. She could not have named why. He was plainly dressed. The house was clearly prosperous, though not showy, and she had no information about him beyond the letter, which had been proper without being revealing. She filed this discomfort away and moved on to what she had come to accomplish. The rest of the afternoon was occupied with the business of Sir Gerald Merton, though it was conducted as if it were not. There were compliments about the park and inquiries about the neighbourhood, and small, careful remarks about the advantage of settled circumstances at Clara's age, which was 24, and which Lady Prentice frequently treated as something requiring management rather than admiration. Sir Gerald told a story about his estate at Dorset that had no apparent point beyond establishing that he had one. Clara poured tea for a second time and was thanked for it in the particular way that people thank furniture, briefly and without meeting its eyes. The morning came grey and cold, and Clara was alone in the corridor outside the morning room when she heard it. She had been on her way to find Mrs. Crane, to ask about the laundry, because she had a thing she needed done, and she preferred to ask the housekeeper directly. The morning room door was not fully latched. She was not listening. She was passing, and the voices carried, and she heard her aunt's voice first. The precise, flat tone Lady Prentice used when she was satisfied she was not being overheard. She has nothing to recommend her but her face and her willingness to be managed. That is sufficient for your purposes. Sir Gerald's voice drier than she had imagined it could be. You are certain she will not make difficulties. She has no one, said Lady Prentice, and she knows it. Clara stood in the corridor. She did not move for a moment. Then she walked past the morning room door and continued down the corridor to the back stairs and out through the kitchen passage to the garden. The kitchen maid she passed looked up and then looked away, as kitchen maids do when they recognize that a face requires privacy. The garden at Wyndham Park in November was a stripped and patient thing. The rose beds had been cut back to stubs, and the gravel paths were dusted with frost that had not yet fully gone. Clara walked along the longest path, the one that ran parallel to the east wall, and she put one foot in front of the other with the care of someone who has decided to feel nothing until she is somewhere she will not be seen. She had no one. Her aunt had said it flatly, as a fact, because it was a fact. Her parents had died when she was 16, and Lady Prentice had taken her in with a kindness that had always been slightly conditional. And now the condition was being applied. She had known, in the abstract way that one knows winter is coming, that this arrangement had been building towards Sir Gerald Merton, or someone very like him. To hear the word purposes spoken in that particular voice was to understand that she had not known it clearly enough. She stopped near the end of the east wall, where a stone bench stood under an elm that was entirely bare. She sat down on it. The cold came straight through her dress. She sat there anyway. Miss Ashworth. She looked up. Mr. Harlow was standing at the entrance to the garden path, his coat dark against the pale stone of the house behind him. He held her shawl in one hand. Mrs. Crane thought you might need this. He walked toward her and held it out. He did not inquire about the quality of her face. He did not ask what had happened. She took the shawl and wrapped it around herself, and he sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a full and proper foot of distance between them, and looked out at the bare elm. They sat for a while. A starling crossed the pale sky above the wall and was gone. "Is the frost hard here in December?" she asked, because she needed to say something ordinary. "The valley holds it," he said. "The house is cold for about a fortnight. After that, it improves." She nodded. The shawl was warm. The elm was very still. "Is it your garden?" she asked. "It will be yours if you stay in it long enough," he said, and there was a dryness in this that was almost a smile. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was watching the wall. But something in his profile was more settled than it had been in the drawing-room, something quieter, as though outside the formal rooms he occupied a different register. "You are kind," she said. "You were kind last night, though I did not know it at the time. "I'm sorry to be an inconvenience." "You are not," he said. He did not say it as a courtesy. He said it as a plain correction. She did not know what to do with that, and so she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the bare elm and allowed herself, for the length of that cold, still morning, to be in a garden in Wiltshire with a man whose name she barely knew, and not to think about anything that was waiting for her inside. He was near enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the cold. She was aware of the steadiness of his breathing and the way his hands were clasped on his knee without tension, and the particular quality of his silence, which was not an empty thing, but a full one. She did not move closer. She did not need to. She sat in the warmth of it and looked at the frozen garden and let herself feel for just one measured moment that she was not entirely without anyone. The Earl's travelling cloak had been pressed and folded with the care of someone who understood that the gesture needed to be exact. Clara had asked Mrs. Crane for the loan of a flat iron and had done it herself, which Mrs. Crane had permitted with the particular, quiet approval of someone who recognizes when a thing needs to be done by the person who means it. The note she wrote was brief. 3 sentences addressed to Mr. Harlow in the formal hand she had been taught at 16 and had never abandoned. She thanked him for the use of the cloak. She apologized for any disruption the evening had caused his household. She was sincerely his, Clara Ashworth. She did not ask for anything. She did not mention Sir Gerald Merton or her aunt or purposes. She folded the note inside the cloak and asked Mrs. Crane to see it to its recipient, and then she went to breakfast as though the morning were entirely ordinary. Lady Prentice saw the cloak. She said nothing in the moment, but her eyes followed Clara across the breakfast room with an expression that was not curiosity so much as calculation, and Clara felt the weight of it across the table and said nothing in return, and ate her toast with perfect composure, and thought of the garden and the frozen elm, and the steadiness of him beside her, and held all of it somewhere interior where it was not available to be looked at or managed or used. The note reached Mr. Harlow in his library, where he was standing at the long window that faced the south lawn. Tobias brought it in and withdrew. He set the cloak down on the reading table. He unfolded the note and read it twice, which was once more than its brevity required. He set it down beside the cloak and stood at the window with his hands behind his back, looking at the lawn, and the expression on his face was one that no one in the house was present to observe. He had not spoken to her about what she was. He had not needed to. He had watched her crouch in a cold coaching inn-yard to help a frightened boy, and he had sat beside her on a stone bench in a November garden and felt the precise quality of her composure under a weight she did not intend to set down. And he had read 3 sentences in a handwriting that was careful and unsentimental and entirely without pretension. And he thought, yes, she is exactly that. He was a man who had been addressed as Your Grace for 31 of his 34 years. He had spent 3 months travelling in another name because he had needed to know what a room felt like when he walked into it, and was simply a man. He had found the experiment instructive and occasionally lonely, and he had told himself it was nearly finished. And then he had gone to retrieve his carriage at a coaching inn in Marlborough, and had watched a woman he had never met stop in a cold, dark yard to help a kitchen boy pick up dropped plates, and he had thought, not quite yet, quite. He stood at the library window until the south lawn grew cold in the failing afternoon light. And then he rang for Tobias, and he said, "Ask Mrs. Crane to lay the drawing-room for tea at 5, and tell her I would like Miss Ashworth to know she is welcome." The afternoon was brief and grey. Clara came to the drawing-room at 5. He was already there, standing by the fire. She came in without hurrying and took the chair across from the fire, and Mrs. Crane brought the tea. And they sat for a while with the cups and the fire and the winter light failing in the windows. And he said, because he had decided he would say it, "I would like you to know that I am glad you are here." She looked at him across the tea table. Her hands were still on the cup. Something in her face went very quiet, the way a room goes quiet when the wind outside stops. And then she said, "I am glad of it too." Her voice was level and plain and utterly without performance, and he felt it land in the particular place behind the sternum where truths that matter tend to land. He did not say more. She did not say more. The fire settled. The light went out of the windows in the west. They drank their tea, and Clara thought, "I want to stay in this room. I want to stay in it very much." She did not say this because the world they were both inside did not permit the saying of it. Not yet. And she was a woman who understood the weight of not yet. But she felt it with the whole of her body. The wanting. The warmth of the fire and his presence and the quiet house. The want of it. He set down his cup. She set down hers. Their eyes met across the table in the way that eyes meet when both people are being careful and both people know it. And the moment was very precisely itself. And then Mrs. Crane came in to take the tea things, and the moment closed around itself like water, without a seam. Lady Prentice had chosen the drawing room as the setting because she had learned early that the right room could do a great deal of a conversation's work for you. She had arranged for Sir Gerald to be present and for Miss Voss to be seated near the door. And she had chosen the hour when the late afternoon made the room feel imposing without being cold. And she had not consulted Clara about any of it. She had simply sent word by way of Emmeline Voss that Clara was expected in the drawing-room at 3, and she had been waiting when Clara arrived. The arrangement was clear enough. Sir Gerald was settled in the largest chair as though he were already at home. Lady Prentice stood near the window. Miss Voss sat by the door with her hands folded and her expression sealed. "Sit down, Clara," said Lady Prentice. Clara sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. "Sir Gerald has made inquiries," Lady Prentice said, "and is prepared to go forward on the terms we discussed. He has been patient, and I have explained your situation to him candidly, and he is prepared to overlook the irregularity of the last 2 days. The matter can be settled before Christmas." Sir Gerald produced a short sound of assent and turned his cane in his hands. Clara looked at her aunt. "I have not agreed to any terms," she said. "The matter does not require your agreement in the legal sense," Lady Prentice said. "You are in my guardianship until you marry. I have agreed on your behalf, as is entirely within my authority." The room was very quiet. Miss Voss turned a page she was not reading. Sir Gerald examined his cane's silver head. Clara felt the cold of it settle through her. She had known this was coming in the abstract way. The particular weight of hearing it said aloud, in this room, in this light, with Sir Gerald's eyes moving to her face and staying there with the expression of a man who had purchased something and was satisfied with the delivery. That weight was specific and real, and she sat inside it without expression. She did not argue. She did not beg. She looked at her aunt with a steadiness that Lady Prentice had always found slightly unnerving, and she said, "I understand." It was the only thing she said. The door from the entrance hall opened, and she heard Tobias's voice in the hall. She heard him speak. She heard a second voice respond, lower, and the sound of steps crossing the stone floor with an unhurried certainty. The drawing-room door, which had been ajar, swung fully open. Mr. Harlow came in. He was not announced. He did not require it. Behind him, Tobias stood for a moment in the doorway and then, because the situation had become something else entirely, said the words, "My lord." Not Mr. Harlow, "My lord." Lady Prentice's head turned toward Tobias. Her face underwent a process that was not quite visible, but was entirely audible in the quality of her silence. Tobias understood that the moment had arrived that would resolve the evening, and he said plainly, because there was no ambiguity left in the room to protect, "The Earl of Wyndham." Sir Gerald's cane struck the floor. Not deliberately, his hand had gone slack. The Earl of Wyndham stood in the middle of his own drawing room and looked at Clara Ashworth, who was looking at him with the particular expression of someone who is assembling something very quickly and very carefully. The way you reassemble a broken object when you want to understand what it was before you decide what it means now. A travelling cloak, a coaching inn, the cleanness of his hands, a bench in a November garden. The way he had said, "You are not an inconvenience," in the exact tone of a correction rather than a courtesy. She held his gaze. His face was very still. Miss Voss's page fell from her lap to the floor and lay there. Lady Prentice said, in a voice that had lost most of its register, "My lord." The Earl of Wyndham turned his gaze from Clara to Lady Prentice, with the unhurried movement of a man who had been addressed as Your Grace since he was 3 years old and found very little intimidating. "Lady Prentice," he said. His voice was the same voice, the same measured, slightly clipped cadence, the same unhurried pace. Nothing about him had changed. Everything about the room had changed. "I was not aware," Lady Prentice began and stopped. "No," he said. He did not explain what she was not aware of. He did not need to. The fire settled in the grate. Sir Gerald made a sound that was almost a word and then was not. Miss Voss reached down and picked up her fallen page and did not look at anyone. "Miss Ashworth," said the Earl of Wyndham, and his voice was quiet, "has been a guest of Wyndham Park. She has conducted herself throughout with the dignity I would expect of anyone who belongs here." The last 2 words landed in the room like something placed on a table, carefully, without drama, with the full weight of what they meant. Lady Prentice looked at Clara. Clara did not look at Lady Prentice. Clara was looking at the Earl, and the Earl was looking at Clara, and what passed between them in that 10 seconds was not something that required the drawing room to hold. It was simply certain. It had been certain she understood now, since before she had known what she was looking at. The Earl then said to Lady Prentice, with perfect courtesy, "I believe Sir Gerald Merton has an appointment in Dorset. It would be a shame to keep him." Sir Gerald rose. He rose with the careful dignity of a man who has understood that the price just increased beyond his means, and he made his bow, and he left. Miss Voss gathered her things and followed with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to read exits. Lady Prentice stood for a moment longer, as if she were still hoping the room would return to its previous arrangement, and then she understood that it would not, and she made a very correct curtsy, and she went. The door closed. The drawing-room held them both in its fire-lit quiet, the December dark pressing against the windows. Mrs. Crane appeared briefly in the doorway with the expression of someone who had suspected this outcome and was satisfied to be right, and then she withdrew. The fire in the grate made its small, steady sound. Clara looked at the man who was the Earl of Wyndham, and then she looked at the man who was Edward Harlow, and she understood that they were the same person, and that she had known the second one first, and that this made her very lucky. "You might have told me," she said. "I might have," he agreed. "I wanted you to know me first." She was quiet for a moment with this. Outside, the sound of the hired chaise on the gravel drive, departing. Then the quiet of the park, complete and cold and very still. "Did you think I would not?" she asked. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the tea table, with the full and careful attention of a man who has learned to look at things exactly and not look away. "No," he said. "I thought you already had." The fire settled again. She was standing near the arm of the chair she had sat in when Lady Prentice had told her the matter did not require her agreement. She was standing in the same room, in the same light, and the room was entirely different. She reached out and set her hand on the chair's back, a small, steadying touch, and she breathed. "I read your note," he said, 3 times. "It was 3 sentences," she said. "Yes," he said. There was the almost smile again, the one that lived in the very corner of his expression and never fully arrived. They were sufficient. She felt the wanting again, the whole body warmth of it, and this time she did not fold it away. She let it be simply what it was, standing in a room that had just finished being the room where everything was decided against her, now rearranged around a different fact. She looked at the Earl, and he was near enough that she was aware of him the way she had been aware of him on the bench in November. The steadiness, the warmth, the quality of his silence that was full rather than empty. He took 1 step toward her, not a declarative step, the step of a man closing a distance he had been patient about for some time. He stopped with less than a foot between them and looked at her face with the attention he would have given something he was not prepared to misread. Her hand was still on the back of the chair. His hand came to rest beside hers on the same surface, not touching, close enough that the warmth of it reached her. She looked at his hand, and then at his face. She made no move to step back. His eyes asked a question that had no adequate period phrasing, and she answered it in the only language the Regency world had given them, by not moving, by breathing, by letting the silence between them be what it clearly was. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and there was a roughness in it that his usual voice never carried. "Clara," she said. The correction was quiet and entirely final. He was still. She was still. The fire said what the room could not. Then he lifted his hand from the chair back and offered it to her, palm upward, in the plain gesture of a man who has decided, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she set her hand in his, and neither of them spoke. The days that followed had a quality that was new to her, the quality of being somewhere she was meant to be. Mrs. Crane stopped pretending not to be pleased about anything. Tobias carried himself with the subtle, additional dignity of a man whose judgment has been vindicated. The library, which Clara had begun to use in the mornings, felt like a room she had always been going to discover. Lady Prentice sent a letter. It was correct and brief and communicated, beneath its careful phrasing, a thorough revision of her previous understanding of Clara's prospects. Clara read it twice and set it on the writing desk beside the window, where the winter light came across the park in the thin, patient way of December mornings in Wiltshire. She did not reply at once. She sat for a moment instead, her hand resting on the surface of the desk, looking out at the frost on the south lawn. The park was bare and very still. A wood pigeon called from somewhere near the elm walk. The fire behind her was burning with the same quiet composure as it had on the morning she woke in a room she did not recognize and could not account for, except that now she recognized all of it. She heard his step in the corridor. She knew his step by now, the particular unhurried weight of it, the way it paused for a moment outside a room before he came in. The library door opened. He came in. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee because Mrs. Crane had apparently relinquished this small duty to him without ceremony, and he set one on the desk beside her hand and kept the other, and he stood at the window with her and looked out at the frost. She picked up the cup. The warmth of it was immediate and real. "Your aunt's letter?" he asked. "Yes." "Do you wish to answer it this morning?" "No," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he agreed. They stood at the window together in the December light, and she felt the warmth of the coffee and the warmth of him beside her, and the warmth of the library at her back. And she looked out at the park and the bare elms and the white frost and the pale sky. And she understood that she was standing in a room she had once looked out of as a stranger, and that she was not a stranger in it any longer. She was not going anywhere. She had not, it seemed, been going anywhere for some time, though she had needed the long, dark carriage road of November and a frost-covered park in Wiltshire to understand it. She took her coffee. She remained at the window. The wood-pigeon called again in the elm walk, and the frost held the park in its quiet, and the library was warm at her back, and she belonged there.